Hello, today we are going to talk about infectious diseases. So, those diseases which are caused by infectious agents. And this is lecture number 12, where we're going to define disease, infectious disease, pathogens, and we're going to classify those diseases by the agent and by the origin. So also route of transmission of that disease will be discussed as well as the stages of infections. So to start with definitions, so we want to be sure that we all understand what we mean and what we're talking about once we mention the word infection, the pathological agent, convalescent, and epidemiology. So, as the name implies, infection, this is something regarding the disease which has clear symptoms and signs, and that was caused by the invasion and multiplication of pathogenic microorganisms. These pathogenic agents can be an agent, a specific agent that causes the diseases. So they can be either bacterium, virus, fungi, parasites. So as a result, we will get infectious disease. So this infectious disease is defined like a disease that is caused by pathogenic agent. And there can be different ways of transmission of these pathogens from one person to another that will also be discussed. And regarding the stage of infectious diseases, we have one stage that is the ultimate stage that is called convalescence, where the patient gets back to normal life by having his normal health back. So epidemiology, it's field of study that is focused on the incidence, distribution, and control of disease in a population. And other terms are related regarding the prevalence of infectious diseases. So let's start with the coronavirus that was announced as pandemic in March 2020. So once we have this term pandemic, it means it covers, this is the infectious disease that covers a broad geographic area and affects a high proportion of people. So in the picture here, for instance, you can see that this is just only for the US and for the Americas part are given. So if it's pandemic, it means that it covers both geographically, broad geographic, and also many peoples are affected. Regarding the epidemic disease, it means that the infectious disease develops very rapidly and it spreads very rapidly to many people. So in that case, it would be here. So it starts, and now it started to spread very rapidly. As you can see, if it started somewhere in the northern western part, and it now starts to spread to the even central part, and this is really fast. So coronavirus was also first epidemic, and then after some months it gained its status to be pandemic. Next is sporadic, and that's infectious diseases which appears infrequently and irregularly. So it can be either in single cases or scattered cases, like typhoid fever or mad cow's disease. So it is exemplified in a way like here. So it's something that occurs at irregular interval of time. So, but it occurs as single cases infrequently. Okay. Regarding the endemic disease, so that's a type of disease who has constant presence or usual presence in a population within a geographic area. So, for instance, dental fluorosis is prevalent in population who inhabits Shechensk region in northern Kazakhstan who drink high fluoride level water. So that's only particular to that type of region, and with that we would call it endemic disease. Now let's move on. So infection, it's for the disease to be infectious diseases, the pathogen needs to invade the host. Yeah, so invasion, it's the ability of the pathogen to be able to enter the host cells or the host tissues, and it should succeed at multiplying there in order to increase its spread. And once they are present in high quantity, they are able to cause the disease, which will be manifested by signs and symptoms. So once we talk about the measure of pathogenicity, we mean virulence. So virulence is the ability of a pathogen to cause the disease. So for instance, you might have heard about avirulent vaccine, which means avirulent, non-virulent. So we have some vaccine particles where the active ingredients specifically taken from pathogen has been inactivated, and then we call it avirulent. So which means that it has absolutely no pathogenicity when it enters our body. So bacteremia, it's another term to define that we have microorganisms in the blood. So it can be either both gram-positive or gram-negative bacteria. So regarding gram-positive bacteria, if they are present, they can be in the form of staphylococci or streptococci, or for gram-negative, it can be bacteroids. And septicemia, it's a blood-borne systemic infection. So sepsis is another term for septicemia. It's presence of microorganisms in the blood, which is also accompanied by the inflammation in the blood. Now let's talk about virulence factors. Basically, these factors are defined as molecules that are produced by bacteria, viruses, or fungi. Why they would need these virulence factors? They would need to facilitate the colonization in the niche of the host. So regarding the bacteria, these virulence factors help them to invade the host, to cause the disease, and to escape the host defense. So there exist different toxins that I would like to go through, which is endotoxins, exotoxins, and slidrophores. So endotoxins, it's toxins which are mostly present on gram-negative bacteria, and this is structural component specific for gram-negative bacteria. So once the gram-negative bacteria with endotoxin, for instance, in the form of lipopolysaccharide, gets multiplied in the host cell, they would cause changes in blood pressure, inflammation, and even some little shock. Now, regarding exotoxins, they can be secreted both in gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, and they can also be secreted from viable bacteria. And these are the types of toxins which are very toxic from all the potent toxins, and they can be categorized based on their biologic effect on host cells. There are three types of exotoxin, being neurotoxin, cytotoxin, and enterotoxin. So neurotoxin, it's toxins which are produced, for instance, by Clostridium botulinum. If you have heard about Botox cosmetics, yeah, This is the type of cosmetics which uses botulinum toxin, and this cosmetics uses a very tiny amount of this botulinum toxin produced by these bacteria in order to prevent the muscle excitation and produce flaccid paralysis around the eyes, yeah, to remove any crow's feet in women. Next is cytotoxin that inhibits protein synthesis in many cell types. And the third is enterotoxin. Entero means something related with the gut. So when these enterotoxins are secreted by the bacterium, they will cause the hypersecretion of water and electrolytes from the intestinal epithelium that will result in watery diarrhea. So therefore, when people get contaminated with the bacteria that secrete exotoxins, they will have vomiting and they will have this diarrhea that is the result of hypersecretion of water. So the third is hydrophores. So those are the ion binding factors that are secreted from the bacteria, and they are involved in a competition for iron in the host cell. So iron is trace mineral that we really need for our own growth, and bacteria would also like to have it. And we know that iron in the blood is already flowing, and it's not available for the bacteria. And iron is always bound to hemoglobin, and also into transferrin, or in the plasma we have transferrin. When the iron is bound in hemoglobin, it's red blood cells, yeah, and lactoferrin, it's iron bound to milk, tears, or saliva. So these are the proteins, hemoglobin, transferrin, and lactoferrin, to which slidrophores, which are secreted from bacteria, are bound. So bacteria, they express receptors for eukaryotic iron-binding proteins, which are hemoglobin, transferrin, and lactoferrin. Now let's talk about the routes of transmission, and you might think that infectious agents, they are everywhere, on the table that you are now working with, on the keyboard that you are typing in, and in the air that you are breathing. So true, yes, they are omnipresent, these infectious agents, and they have found their way to get to the host cells through many different routes of transmission, including respiratory transmission, that is for the coronavirus, that employs the respiratory route, and it's widely used by many infectious agents, including viruses and bacteria. Second is fecal oral transmission. So it's called indirect transmission because it's not from a sick person to a healthy person. It implies that when the person drinks or eats the food that was prepared by infected person, then the infectious agents gets to the healthy person from the food or drink that was prepared by the dirty hands, by the contaminated hands of the sick person. Or the water can be released into the sewage can be untreated and can be released into the drinking water supply, and this way people can get salmonella, E. coli infections. So here we have food and drinking water as the major object from where we get the bacteria. The third is sexual transmission, where people get different types of bacteria and even viruses like HIV. And so how it happens is regarding the exchange of fluid or that in that can be either directly uh, transmitted between the surfaces in contact. Next is the transmission by direct contact. It means when you touch the doorknobs or the buttons in the elevator, which were previously being touched by the sick person, and microorganisms can be left there. So you know that the microorganisms in the form of bacteria, they can live for many hours compared to viral particles, for instance. So they will still be there, and people, healthy person, if he or she touch that, can, and then he brings it to his mouth or nose, it can, those microorganisms can get easily entered into the respiratory tract or the mucus system of the previously healthy person. So it's very important that everyone does not share the towel or any items of personal hygiene with another people, so that the transmission by direct contact is minimized as possible. The other type of transmission is called iatrogenic, that employs the injections, blood transfusions, or transplantation of some material during the medical procedure. So this type of transmission of microorganisms are also possible. Therefore, we need to always be vigilant to the use of disposable syringes, sterile pipettes in medical cabinets. So here just a quick picture to show you that we have infectious agents in abundance in the air that we breathe, and when you do a handshake, when you hug someone or kiss someone or stay in close contact, there is also big probability that infection will get into your body. Also make sure what kind of water you drink, the source of water that it comes, and also you need to make sure that during the blood transfusions or during the sexual intercourse, many infections agents can go through very easily. And bacteria or fungi or virus, they are very clever in a way that they have found the different entry of infection starting from the nose, mouth, urogenital tract, hands, so all the respiratory tract, uh, they are all well employed by these microorganisms to invade the host and find their niche and multiply there to cause the disease symptoms. So we always classify the entry of infection into cutaneous, airway mucosal, gastrointestinal mucosal, urogenital mucosal, and blood or lymph vessel walls. So for airway mucosal, we can tell that it's for coronavirus, gastrointestinal mucosal, that is for E. coli infection, salmonella infection, helicobacter infection, urogenital, those for different viruses like herpes simplex virus. So all these are the entry routes for the specific viruses and bacteria. So these entrance points are very important in terms that they determine the disease. So for instance, if a streptococcus invades at tonsils, we call it tonsillitis. Yeah, that's inflammation of tonsils as a result of bacterial invasion. If it's a skin, we call it dermatitis. So it depends where the entrance point of the pathogenic agent is. If it's uterus, we call it endometritis. And regarding size of infection, it can be either localized or generalized infection. If it's localized, the sign will be just local inflammation. If it's generalized infection, then the pathogen not only stop at the entrance site, but it will further invade the host by entering the bloodstream. And influenza, syphilis, hepatitis, and many viral infections are the example of generalized infection, whereas specific local injury of the tissue is for the localized infection, and it can be exemplified by tuberculosis or tonsillitis. So we already covered in past lectures regarding the bacteria, viruses, and today we are going to talk what kind of disease they cause. So for bacteria, general disease which are Mycobacterium tuberculosis, that's the type of bacteria, very pathogenic bacteria, which is the agent for tuberculosis. For viruses, it's the influenza virus, which causes seasonal flu. For fungi, they produce toxins, and they are the result of the athletes of food disease. For instance, for parasites, they cause malaria, and they live and grow in our body with tissue destructions. So here is the bacteria. We know that bacteria are very small, tiny creatures. They are single-celled organisms, belong to prokaryotes, and they are omnipresent, inhabiting in different parts of the earth, and we also live with them. We have many types of bacteria in our body, in our gut as well. For viruses, they are acellular agents which have infectious particles. They are much, much smaller than bacteria. Despite being such a tiny particles, they are very, very successful in causing many different diseases that we will cover. So they need the healthy living cells in order to replicate themselves, assemble their proteins, and be ready to infect other cells. Next is fungi. Fungi are eukaryotic organisms which include yeasts, molds, and mushrooms, and they have cell walls that contain chitin, and they're also omnipresent in a way that we can find them in dead matter, or they can live as symbionts of plants, animals, or other fungi. Parasites or protozoa, they're unicellular, they're eukaryotes, and they have very active and flexible movements. They were acquired through can be acquired through contaminated food or water, or by the bite of an infected flies or mosquito. Now let's talk about the viral infectious disease. Let's start with the hepatitis C. That is the reason for causing liver cirrhosis. So now in your picture you have a healthy liver, and on the bottom you see the liver that is cirrhosis. So hepatitis C causes this, and a person who has this virus sometimes do not manifest any symptom of it, they just live with it, and this type of virus is transmitted by blood. And nowadays the inflammation of the liver can lead to many adverse health conditions, and the ultimate is cirrhosis. And it's a very such a difficult health burden for many countries, and now it's estimated that above 350,000 people die from it, and there are more than 170 million people who are diagnosed with it. Unfortunately, there is no vaccine available, but still some treatments are being proposed, but for now with no high success rate. Another viral infectious disease is the genital herpes, which is a sexually transmitted disease. It's caused by herpes simplex virus. So during the sexual intercourse, the person who has herpes simplex virus can transmit it to their partner. So therefore, it is highly advisable to be in a monogamous relationship, and There is also another type of virus that is in the oral herpes virus that can also be transmitted. So it's really important as the many people can be just carriers for HSV, but they might not manifest the symptoms like it's given here in the picture. However, they can just be healthy carriers that will just transmit it to the person whose immune system, for instance, compromised, like weakened, and the receiving person will then develop the signs and symptoms of it. Next, the viral infectious disease is called chickenpox, and it's called virus varicella zoster, or it's also known as herpes virus 3. It's a very highly contagious disease, and people can get it through the direct touch, direct wearing of clothes, wearing of clothing in a, or they can get it from the air, like through the air respiratory tract. And the symptoms are like this, like if there are small dots on the back, which can be in the form of ulcers or small papules or blisters that contain some liquid in it. Let's move on with bacterial infectious disease and talk about tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was announced to be a global emergency by World Health Organization as it caused 3 million deaths each year, suggesting that one-third of the world's population is infected. And also, the cause of tuberculosis disease is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is very, very uh, pathogenic and very. So the symptoms are uh, when person coughs non-stop, that lasts for more than 3 weeks, and if during coughing there is secretion of blood or mucus, and appetite loss, weight loss, they are all manifestations of the disease. And the disease belongs to the bacterial origin that spreads through tissues, and it mainly affects lungs. So next is salmonella infections, and it's also a big health care burden in the United States, for instance, where almost 1 million people die due to the contamination from these salmonella infections. And Salmonella typhimurium, here as you see, they are grown in petri dishes. They are gram-negative rod-shaped bacteria. That is the cause for big cause of food contamination. So be it like raw sausage, raw meat, or chicken, or even sometimes unwashed fruit and vegetables can be a source for salmonella, and they cause salmonellosis disease that is manifested by diarrhea, severe abdominal cramps, vomiting, and it's really also uh, important to thermally process the food before eating it, and to store it correctly in the fridge, not to leave it at room temperature, so that this kind of foodborne pathogens do not contaminate the food, which will be further digested by the person. Now let's talk biofilms, which involves many different types of bacteria living together. So we know that microorganisms do not exist alone, they are not isolated on their own. They tend to live together, and they know that once they are in close proximity to each other, they are in a beneficial mode for exchanging information, for exchanging nutrients, for being resistant to some kind of antimicrobial agents. So all these features allow the bacteria to live in communities, and once they form these communities with different types of microorganisms, they will be living on that surface, and we call it biofilm. So this biofilm can be the catheter that is being administered once someone is in the medical cabinet, like a urine catheter, or it can be, let's say, your contact lenses that you wear. It can also have biofilm of bacteria, but you might never be aware of that. And another example is the dental plaque that is defined as a biofilm, which is actually accumulation of bacteria which are encapsulated on the teeth surface. So we also call them plaque, which needs to be removed at the dentist. So when these organisms form a biofilm, once they have these communities on some kind of matrix, they can really be able to quickly adapt to some changes that occur in that specific niche and in that specific environment by changing or modifying the expression of their genes. And they can also be resistant to some kind of disinfectant agents, and so this all allow them to survive, to thrive, and to build their community in a strong way. So now let's talk about diseases which are called by parasites. One of them is called sleeping sickness, that is prevalent in African countries. It's a chronic disease that is caused by Trypanosoma brucei, as you can see. Biofilms, which involves many different types of bacteria living together. So we know that microorganisms do not exist alone, they are not isolated on their own. They tend to live together, and they know that once they are in close proximity to each other, they are in a beneficial mode for exchanging information, for exchanging nutrients, for being resistant to some kind of antimicrobial agents. So all these features allow the bacteria to live in communities, and once they form these communities with different types of microorganisms, they will be living on that surface, and we call it biofilm. So this biofilm can be the catheter that is being administered once someone is in the medical cabinet, like a urine catheter, or it can be, let's say, your contact lenses that you wear. It can also have biofilm of bacteria, but you might never be aware of that. And another example is the dental plaque that is defined as a biofilm, which is actually accumulation of bacteria which are encapsulated on the teeth surface. So we also call them plaque, which needs to be removed at the dentist. So when these organisms form a biofilm, once they have these communities on some kind of matrix, they can really be able to quickly adapt to some changes that occur in that specific niche and in that specific environment by changing or modifying the expression of their genes. And they can also be resistant to some kind of disinfectant agents, and so this all allow them to survive, to thrive, and to build their community in a strong way. So now let's talk about diseases which are called by parasites. So sleeping sickness that is prevalent in African countries is caused by Trypanosoma brucei, and the vector for this type of diseases are the flies called tsetse flies. So, what is sleeping sickness? It's a disturbance of sleep when the person mostly feels fatigue and tiredness during the daytime and has insomnia during the nighttime. And during the primary stage of the disease, there is a general symptoms like a headache, pain in the joints, and itching. However, when the disease proceeds to the secondary stage, there are neurological phase because the parasite Trypanosoma brucei can cross the blood-brain barrier and impair mental abilities of the affected person, so that they would have ataxia, some trouble in their gait, and if it's left non-treated, it can be really fatal. So how it occurs is that these are your Trypanosoma brucei. So these are the parasites which can be in the blood of the infected person, and when the tsetse flies bites the infected person with this trypanosoma, they will just carry it to other people whom they bite. So these tsetse flies find this trypanosoma in their blood meal. Therefore, it is called a vector that transmits it from the sick person to another people. This way, this trypanosoma is being transmitted, and this way how sleeping sickness is developed. So the symptoms can be it can take some time, starting from months to years before the very first symptoms appear. So now let's talk about fungal infections, and perhaps majority of you know about candidiasis. That is a type of fungi which causes itching, rashing, and it can be either found in the mouth or in the urogenital tract. So these are the all yeast infections, and perhaps you have noticed that if you eat lots of sweet, there is a more probability that someone would develop this candidiasis. So it affects different varieties part of our body. It can be patches in the mouth, or in this case, it's esophagitis, or it can be vaginal yeast infections, which are all manifested by skin itching and rashes. So they can be also fungal infection in the bloodstream. So, for instance, in the vagina or in the vulva, there will be severe itching, soreness, and irritation that would be demonstrated by whitish or cottage cheese-like discharge. That would be the case to see a doctor who will prescribe some antifungal creams to be applied, or some pills, and also to boost the immune system. Next is of fungal infection. It's the athlete's foot disease that is caused by fungi called Tricha python. So here is the shape of it. And when the person is wearing very tight-fitting shoes, and or he or she has over sweating toes, they would have itching, stinging, and burning. And that is the athlete's foot, so where they would have this fungal infection going on. So now let's talk about the different stages of infectious disease. So we first have the beginning of disease, and then disease will reach its culmination, and then after some time it will uh, regress, so the patient can get back to its normal life. So now let's move one by one. So the pathological process would involve the incubation period, followed by prodromal period. That is, then they would have the period of illness, that is the manifestation of first signs and symptoms of the disease, and that would be the culmination during the pathological process of the infectious disease. And then we will have the decline, followed by the convalescence period. So in this picture, you have all of these 5 stages demonstrated, which are also related to the number of pathogens. So as you can see, during the incubation period, they will start their multiplication, they will be invading host, and they will have many of their particles and their numbers growing until the disease gets its culmination. And the symptoms, they are blue. So during the incubation period, for instance, there are no any symptoms. However, the bacteria is already preparing itself for multiplication, and it's about to start to cause the first symptoms at the prodromal phase only, and then the signs and symptoms of the disease would accelerate very rapidly, and it will be in parallel with the rise of the um, microorganismal particle increase. And then at the culmination peak, when the signs and symptoms of the disease would start would reduce, the number of pathogens would also reduce. So incubation, from the Latin word incubatio, it means sleeping or lying. So basically, it's a time when the organism was able to get into the site of infection, and now it starts to replicate itself. And it's basically the time when the patient absolutely is not aware that he or she has that pathogen, or that he would develop the disease. So it's a very quiet period, and this period can be very different from many types of diseases. So for instance, for salmonella food that comes from the contaminated food, it will be like during that day that the person would have vomiting, diarrhea. So it's a very short incubation time for salmonella to manifest its first disease symptoms. Regarding the, for instance, syphilis, it's a couple of weeks. For hepatitis B, it can be between 1 to 6 months. For AIDS and leprosy, it might take years and years before the patient would know that he or she had that pathogen in his body. So during the incubation period, as we just saw, we will have the rise of bacteria or viral particles, and depending on the type of pathogens, and depending on the site of infection and the strength of the infectious dose received by the body, incubation period can be different, as it's given in the table. Prodromal period is followed by the incubation period, when the first manifestation of signs and symptoms would appear. So we will have first general symptoms in the form of fever, inflammation, and soreness that would result from the activation of immune system. So our immune system would sense that there is some foreign pathogens, some foreign invaders and in our body, and it will give us signals in the form of high fever, high temperature, high inflammation, which will be also demonstrated by the pain in the joints or in muscles. So next period of illness is followed by prodromal period, and it's where we will have specific symptoms of the disease that would be more evident and severe. And after that, we would have successful period of decline, when pathogen particles would start decline, and also we would get day by day the disappearance of signs and symptoms. But here we need to be sure that the patient would not relax and go to public here, because the patient is more susceptible to develop secondary infection because his primary immune system has been a bit weakened as they were all playing as the primary immune system was already playing a big role here to combat the disease. So here in the period of decline, no one should get relaxed, but take more medication, take more sleep in order to recharge the body. And after that, the last step, it's a period of convalescence where we will have gradual recovery of health. However, some patients would have permanent damage to their health as a result of consequences of the infectious disease. So here is it. I thank you all for your kind attention.